September 1303. The Almogavar troops are armed to the teeth, and in front of them are the Genoese mercenaries, who considerably outnumber them. A pitched battle is about to erupt in the streets of Constantinople, a battle between allies that will drench every corner of the city in blood. In the year 1303, Sicily was at peace, ruled by Frederick II, King of Sicily, and brother of James II of Aragon. It turns out that the Almogavars had fought for the new monarch of the island. There were about 8,000 of them, including servants and relatives, and right now idle. They were starting to cause problems on the island. At the other end of the Mediterranean, we have Andronicus II Palaiologos, Emperor of Byzantium. And what happens to him? Well, he's dying. In the previous century, the Byzantine Empire had been dissected, and its capital had come to be ruled by the Latin Empire. Something that didn't last long, as decades later the Byzantine Empire would resurface, replacing the Latin one. The problem is that the new Byzantine Empire is very weakened and is not capable of facing its multiple enemies. We have the Serbs slowly snatching territory from the empire. We have the Latin states of Greece warring with the Byzantines, and finally, we have the most dangerous enemy, the Turks. These had arrived in Anatolia from the interior of Asia and were divided into various sultanates, the most important being the one led by Osman, which would be known as the Ottoman Sultanate. Does that sound familiar to you? The Ottomans would become more and more powerful, imposing themselves over the rest. It turns out that the Turks, in the year 1301, had defeated the imperial armies, which were led by Michael, the emperor's son. It was clear that the Byzantines were incapable of defeating their enemies in open field. And they had not been wiped out of Asia Minor, thanks solely to the powerful defenses of the cities. Solution: Andronicus decided to hire mercenaries, something common at that time. He already had mercenaries, such as, for example, Genoese, but he had heard of a fearsome mercenary company that had helped Frederick II to take the throne of Sicily, the Almogavars. Basically, Frederick II wanted to get these mercenaries off the island, because during peace they caused too many altercations. Andronicus wanted these mercenaries because they were very good in battle, and Roger de Flor, leader of the company, was looking for a new contract to fight. Everyone was winning. Roger, in exchange for coming to Andronicus's aid, wanted, among other things, the title of Megaduke of the Empire and to be married to someone from the imperial family. The agreement was accepted, and Andronicus sent a fleet so that the Almogavars could embark and could arrive in Constantinople. In total, those who set sail were about 4,000 infantrymen, 1,500 knights, and about 1,000 sailors and their families. In September 1303, the Almogavars arrived in Constantinople, where they were received with honors by the emperor himself, by his son Michael, by nobles of the empire, and by the Orthodox Church. Roger de Flor was immediately invested as Megaduke of the Empire. And then his men paraded down the triumphal promenade. This promenade was the one used by the ancient Roman legions to parade in the capital of the Eastern Empire. As they paraded, Michael, the heir, as well as a large number of nobles. They looked with envy and contempt at the honors that were given to these mercenaries, who wore rags and professed the Catholic religion, enemy of the Orthodox. For their part, the civilians looked curiously at these mercenaries that their emperor had brought, and who were supposed to save them from the Turks. And do you know who else was suspiciously watching the Almogavars, the Genoese mercenaries? These were camped in the Pera district on the other side of the Golden Horn, and they feared that the Almogavar presence was the spearhead of Aragonese trade in the east. Think that the Republic of Genoa, like for example that of Venice, I'm sure you all know Marco Polo. It had power and wealth thanks to trade. and it was interested in keeping competition to a minimum. Constantinople is the link between East and West, the final destination of the famous Silk Road. And if only Genoa carried goods from the city to the rest of Europe, it was very lucrative. But if the Aragonese got involved, more competition appeared and profitability was reduced. Bad news for their business. The Aragonese camped next to the palace, and just like in Sicily, since there was no war, they started causing a ruckus. Thefts, duels, murders. Now, did Andronicus know why Frederick intended to get rid of these mercenaries? The Almogavars would leave once the link between Roger and the Byzantine princes took place, so Andronicus decided to speed up the union. Finally, Roger de Flor married Princess Maria of Bulgaria, so soon the Almogavars could leave to fight against the Turks in Anatolia. However, before they left, they would leave their mark. The same night of the wedding, an Almogavar was walking alone through the streets and crossed paths with a group of Genoese who insulted him for his ragged appearance. The Almogavar, without hesitation, in a single moment, he drew his sword and charged at the Genoese, killing 2 of them before they could even react. The sound of the fight echoed through the nearby streets, which caused some Almogavars and Genoese to approach to see what was happening. Of course, seeing their respective companions in danger, they joined the fight that was escalating by the moment. Several dozen warriors from both sides were already fighting in that street and in the surrounding streets. As we saw in the previous chapter, where I introduced the Almogavars, we saw that they were very good in duels, in scattered combat, so this type of street fight was their thing. And soon they began to wreak havoc among the Genoese. The Genoese leader, upon learning of what was happening, summoned all his men and marched to the palace, where Roger was celebrating the union, as well as the emperor himself. And what was next to the palace? The camp? The Genoese formed threateningly, hurling insults at the Almogavars and calling for the emperor to punish them. The Almogavars neither short nor lazy. They armed themselves without receiving any order to do so and marched together in front of the Genoese, raising high the flag of the Crown of Aragon. The situation was very tense, with both sides hurling all kinds of insults at each other, and it only needed a tiny spark for everything to explode. It could have been a stone throw, a javelin, or an arrow. The fact is that everything came together. The Almogavars charged, shouting Despertafero to the 4 winds. The Aragonese mercenaries were experts in dueling and fighting in dispersed formation, so they needed to break the enemy formation. And they had trained for that. Little by little, they made a hole in the Genoese shield wall until the formation could not maintain cohesion and fell apart. The Genoese saw how a horde of ragged barbarians had broken their formation and were mercilessly stabbing them without taking prisoners. When a Genoese surrendered, he would throw his weapon and kneel down. The Almogavars, instead of capturing him, would slit his throat one after another. The Genoese panicked and turned around. And then, at that moment, the Almogavars stopped being warriors and became hunters. They pursued the Genoese and, thanks to their light equipment, they caught up with them from behind and executed them. There was no mercy, there was no quarter. When Almogavar fury is unleashed, their human side disappears, and that's what makes them unbeatable in battle. Without fear, without ethics, without thoughts, just kill, kill, and kill. The streets of Constantinople turned into a pitched battle, where the Genoese carpeted the avenues. Andronicus sent emissaries to stop the slaughter, but the Almogavars also executed them, and they went street by street looking for the Genoese to exterminate them, to exterminate their alleged allies. Soon, an idea quickly spread throughout the Aragonese host. Why stop at eliminating the mercenaries on this side of the Golden Horn? They should embark, cross the waters, disembark in the Pera district, and wipe out the entire Genoese colony, including their families. Seeing that the mercenaries were going to the Golden Horn, Andronicus saw what they intended and begged Roger de Flor to stop his men. He obeyed, gathered his officers, mounted their steeds, and set off at a gallop to the front of Almogavar, traversing streets that had turned red with Aragonese blood. They managed to reach them and finally stop them. The slaughter had ended. The next day, a recount was made of what had happened, and the combat and military capability of the Almogavars was demonstrated. 3,000 Genoese had lost their lives that day. In exchange, only a few dozen Almogavars had fallen. Impressive. Now they had faced their allies, so collaborating with them to defeat the Turks would become a complicated task. In addition, the admiral of the Byzantine fleet had died during the massacre. What were the consequences of this fight? Well, first of all, Roger de Flor appointed a trusted Almogavar as admiral of the fleet, so that during future campaigns, he would be sure that whenever he needed it, the fleet would be there to help him. On the other hand, Miguel and Andronico saw the need to immediately send the Almogavares out of the capital, to fight at the front as soon as possible. A few days later, the Almogavars, led by Roger de Flor, marched to the coast of the Bosphorus, and there they embarked on the Byzantine fleet. The fleet set course for Anatolia. Their goal was to disembark the Almogavares on imperial territory, so that from there they could march to confront the Turks. The fleet would arrive at Cape Artaki. But we will see that what initially promised to be a force of salvation would become a torment for the Greeks settled there. But we will see this in the next chapter.